For the compilers of the 8th century law tracts, there certainly existed a hierarchy of kingship. Creed Gowlock sets out a threefold division of kingship: a rí ben, a rí budin, and sitting atop the pile, a rí bunad gach gin, a sort of king of kings. Other law texts, like the Urquhart Beck and the Miad set out slightly different schemas, but we may speak in general terms of a king of a single tua, or a petty kingdom, a king who asserted a form of authority over a number of petty kings, and a king of kings who would rule over an area roughly analogous in size with the modern province. In fact, a chanson de geste composed by the invaders, now referred to as the Deeds of the Normans in Ireland, and certainly more on this later, which commemorated the invasion, perhaps sums the situation in Ireland in the late 12th century most succinctly. In Ireland, there were as many kings as counts elsewhere, but those who hold Meath and Leinster, and Desmond and Munster, and Connacht and Ulster, which the 6 brothers once held, those who hold these are the principal kings of Ireland, according to the Irish. These kings of Munster and Connacht and so forth that the song mentions, these are the powerful over-kings or provincial kings envisaged by the writers of the law tracts. Lesser kings acknowledge the supremacy of over-kings by offering up tribute. So a plurality of kingships certainly remained a reality right up to the moment that the first invaders landed on these shores. Yet we should not think of Irish kingship as immutable, as archaic. Certainly, an older generation of historians are happy to portray Irish kings in such a fashion, concentrating, as they did, on all that might be termed unusual or esoteric, pagan survivals and curious inauguration rites that involved horses and fertility goddesses. Such a view is, happily, no longer in vogue, and since the late 1980s, historians of medieval Ireland have tended to focus on the ways in which Irish kingship evolved over the course of time, and some have seen evidence of continental developments also taking root in Ireland. Lamentably, I might add, certain historians not specialising in medieval Ireland have persisted in seeing Irish kingship, and Irish society more generally, as alien and backward. A recent paper on the decline of regicide by a certain professor of Norwegian history, Irish kings were excluded from his study because they were different and more difficult to compare. Meanwhile, in Volume 1 of the new Cambridge History of Ireland, Nicholas Vincent depicts the Irish who arrived in Ireland, or the English rather, who arrived in Ireland in the late 1160s, as time travellers to an Iron Age, closer to the world of Bede than to that of Chrétien de Troyes. For those who advocate a view of medieval Irish society and medieval Irish kingship more specifically as outward-looking and responsive to wider European trends, the reign of Brian Boru is seen as something of a watershed moment. Some, like Dáithí Ó Crónainn, have been content to speak of a new breed of post-Clontarf king. The Battle of Clontarf is recorded as a victory for Brian and the Dál Gash, but of course it also ended with his death. Contemporary sources recording his death styled him Rí Néireann, or King of Ireland, and Ardrí, or High King, of the Irish of Ireland and of the foreigners and of the Britons, and the Augustus of the whole of northwest Europe. To understand Brian's achievement, it is necessary to know something about the institution of the High Kingship. Those older law tracts mentioned at the outset are largely, but not absolutely, silent on the subject. We do hear mention in the annals of individuals styled Rex Temro, or King of Tara, individuals like Niall Call or Donogh Middy, who died in the 9th and the late 8th century respectively. The kingship of Tara was monopolised by the Nael, who, along with the Ogonacht, were the most powerful and politically significant federations of dynastic groups in early medieval Ireland. The kingship of Tara alternated between the two segments of the Nael, the northern and the southern, with some exceptions. Tara's importance was largely symbolic. It was used to legitimise their rule, much like other symbolic sites like Cashel, which was used by the Ogonacht to buoy claims of supremacy in Munster. That said, many kings of Tara, like the aforementioned Niall Calla, resided nowhere near Tara. Niall was a member of the Cennin Logan, situated in what is now County Tyrone. On the death of Mulchaire MacMurrough of the southern Nael, however, The Annals of Ulster cite him Rí Éireann, or King of Ireland, the first contemporaneous use of the term in the Irish annals. Later, in 980, Donal O'Neill, another king of the Kenalogan, a branch of the Northern Ní Nael, is styled Ard Rí Éireann, or High King of Ireland, in the Annals of Ulster, although other chronicles, like the Annals of Inishfallen and the Chronicon Scotorum, label him Rí Temrach, or King of Tara. One wonders as to the extent to which the usage of this term, Ard Rí, in the annals reflected continental developments. Otto I of Germany had been crowned emperor in Rome in 962, and Edgar's coronation took place at Bath in England in 973, just 7 short years before Donald was styled Ard Rí by the annalists. 25 years later, we see Brian Boru, the most illustrious Irish king of his age, labelled Imperator Scotorum, or Emperor of the Irish, by Mael Sohan, Brian's confessor, in the Book of Armagh. And historians have certainly, in this instance, been happy to suggest that the use of this particular term was the product of continental influences, the coronations of Edgar and Otto just mentioned. How much more important an influence was proximity in time, then, on the annalist, who bestowed on Donal the title of Ard Rí. Indeed, there is much to commend the view that the use of the term Imperator Scotorum was the apotheosis of a long-standing development, one that drew on both continental and insular antecedents. Brian's greatest innovation was not in cultivating flowery titles then, but on gaining, as a member of the Dáil Gash, recognition as High King of Ireland, however begrudgingly, by some commentators. The Annals of Tiernan, for example, in an entry under the year 1000, state that Brian began to rule through treachery. If we see the titles of Rex Temro and Rí Éireann and Ard Rí Éireann as part of the same process of evolution, then it is fair to say that the kingship of all Ireland, or the idea of such a kingship, had, for some several hundred years, been monopolised by the Í Nael. No doubt many a strong Munster king would have refuted this, but we may nevertheless reasonably speak of an Í Nael monopoly of the kingship up to the close of the 10th century. This is not to say that they ruled in any tangible sense outside of Í Nael territories, of course, though Mael Sheachlan I, who died in 862, became the first Í Nael king to secure the submission of Munster. Brian's great achievement was blowing open the whole edifice. Up until his rise to power from obscure beginnings in what is now County Clare, the Í Nael were perceived to be the most powerful group in Ireland. Brian showed that anyone could make a go at becoming the most powerful ruler in Ireland. Indeed, it was Brian himself who went further than most before him towards actually realising a claim to kingship over the whole island, though he was, of course, never completely successful in this endeavour, and what he had fought to create died with him. Indeed, no king thereafter would ever attain mastery over the whole island. The ultimate prize, in the years prior to the invasion, was to be recognised as Rí Éireann Co Frasara, or King of Ireland with opposition. Indeed, while Mael Sheachlan was able to regain the kingship of Ireland after Clontarf, up until his death in 1022, we see nobody termed King of Ireland or High King for a full half-century thereafter. To be clear, the High Kingship did not imply anything like a centralised monarchy, of the type that one might imagine when one thinks of France under the later Capetian rulers, or England after the invasion in 1066. Indeed, it is this perceived lack of centralisation that has engendered the view of Ireland as different and backwards. No, the title of Rí Éireann Co Frasara was usually only awarded when a king had, by force, gained supremacy over most of the other important Irish kings. The story of Ireland between the Battle of Clontarf up to the English invasion is largely the story of powerful kings vying against one another in a bid to become the most powerful king in the country. The 12th century in particular was a time of shifting alliances and large, bloody battles. It is these kings, those men acknowledged as kings of Ireland by contemporaries, men like Turlough O'Brien, Muircheartaigh O'Brien, Turlough O'Connor and Muircheartaigh MacLachlan, that have been seen by modern historians as being of a peculiarly new breed. The 2 centuries or so prior to the English invasion were certainly a period of tremendous change, and not exclusively within the realm of kingship. It was also a time of great change in the church, and we see, in this period, both the spirit and structure of the Irish church shaped by the currents of European-wide reform. The consensus also seems to be that the kings of the 11th and 12th centuries were able to draw on economic and financial resources beyond those available to their predecessors. This allowed Irish kings to engage in more protracted military campaigns. O'Croneen has spoken of the economic expansion on which such developments were based. According to Mary Therese Flanagan, there is no doubt that warfare in Ireland intensified in consequence of Brian's bid for the High Kingship. Certainly, we hear of innovations within this sphere, naval battles and curious references to fortifications termed cashdole in the Irish sources. Many of the greater kings of the 11th and 12th centuries were great builders. Turlough O'Connor was a great builder of the cashdole just mentioned, and we see Turlough O'Brien construct bridges at O'Brien's Bridge and Killaloe in County Clare. Amongst the greatest royal mandated building works, though, were ecclesiastical structures. Brian's descendants, the O'Brien, patronised the building of mortared stone churches at Ardpatrick in County Limerick and at Killaloe and Kilfenora in County Clare, to name but a few. Brian himself is portrayed as a builder of churches in the 12th century propagandistic text, Cogha Gael Ray Goliv. By him were erected also noble churches in Ireland and their sanctuaries. Many works also and repairs were made by him. By him were erected the Church of Keldalua and the Church of Inishcaltra and the bell tower of Tuamgrana and many other works in this manner. Diarmuid MacMurrough, the subject of our inquiry, founded Baltinglass Abbey in 1148 and confirmed by charter a grant made to a Cistercian abbey in Kilkenny in 1162. Indeed, it is within the realm of church patronage that we see how receptive the greater Irish kings were to continental influences. Again, we might use Diarmuid himself as an example, for he was a keen patron of many of the new continental orders, like the Cistercians, as I've just said, but also the Aroasians. He founded the Abbey of St. Mary de Hagas for them in 1146 and introduced them to All Hallows Priory in Dublin in 1162. In his charters, we see MacMurrough exempt ecclesiastical institutions from secular taxation, which was a key tenet of the Gregorian reform movement, which affected many aspects of European politics from the 11th century. We also see evidence for the impact of continental peace movements in Ireland. Flanagan and Ivweni have seen evidence for the influence of the peace and truce of God movements, which had their origin in late 10th and early 11th century France in Ireland. Quite simply, the peace of God sought to protect the vulnerable from the ravages of war. The truce of God is agreed to have first appeared in 1027 at the Council of Toulouse. It sought to curtail violence on certain days and at certain times of the year. There was more to these movements than simply limiting violence, though this was important. People sought deliverance from natural disaster too, storms, famine, disease. Important in this respect was the cult of saints' relics. The movement sought to restore the peace and unity Christ left humankind. The Cáin agus Recht, issued by Donogh MacBrian in 1040, takes on a new resonance when viewed in this context. Essentially, the law declared that no one should steal cattle, fight, or work on a Sunday. A law and ordinance such as was not enacted in Ireland from Patrick's time was made by Brian's son to the effect that none should dare to steal or to do feats of arms on a Sunday, or go out on a Sunday carrying any load, and furthermore, that none should dare to fetch with cattle within doors. Sunday was one of the days on which the Truce of God movements sought to prohibit violence. Donogh passed another law in 1050, restraining every injustice from small to great. This law, the annalist tells us, was passed against a background of bad weather and food shortages, which, in turn, precipitated social breakdown. Much inclement weather happened in the land of Ireland, which carried away corn, milk, fruit, and fish from the people, so there grew up dishonesty among all, but no protection was extended to church or fortress, gossipred or mutual oath until the clergy and laity of Munster assembled. As has just been mentioned, the Peace of God movement sought to provide deliverance from more than human violence. It aimed to prevent the blights of storms, famine, and disease. It sought to prop up a crumbling social order. According to Adamar, the Peace Council convened at Limoges in 994, met because of an outbreak of St. Anthony's fire, or ergotism. Donegal's 1050 law must be seen in this context. Not solely concerned with limiting human-on-human violence, the Convention of Clergy and Laity at Killaloe sought to stave off the worst ravages of natural disaster and to combat social collapse, aims which were very much in keeping with those of the Continental Peace of God movement. We see evidence for the influence of the Peace and Truce of God movements elsewhere too. At the Synod of Kells in 1152, at which there was a strong reformist presence, violent crime, robbery and rape, bad morals and evils of every kind were condemned. This, now it must be said, was the exception rather than the rule at synods of this kind, like Cashel in 1101 and Rathbrazel in 1111, though this might have something to do with the rather patchy survival of decisions reached at these councils. Overwhelmingly, though, the churchmen in attendance seem to have been more concerned with the division of territories into dioceses and marriage reform than with violence. But these synods are themselves evidence for the willingness of powerful Irish rulers to engage in the reform process. The great synods were presided over by Irish kings. The Synod of Cashel in 1101 was convened by Muircheartaigh O'Brien. He also attended the Synod of Rathbrazel, held 10 years later. In 1144, we are told, a great gathering of the men of Ireland, laymen and clerics, was convened by Turlough O'Connor and by Turlough O'Brien. O'Connor also had a role to play in the Synod of Kells, held 8 years later, in 1152. For, in the words of Donegal Curran, reform favoured kings, and they knew it. Kings came to work closely with reformers, courted by the prestige and flattery from popes that came with it. The Irish kings of the 11th and 12th centuries involved themselves in transmarine politics to a greater extent than those kings that had gone before them. Diarmuid MacMurrough involved himself in Welsh politics to such an extent that one set of annals saw fit to term him King of the Welsh. His lengthy obit in the Welsh Chronicles suggests that he had some involvement in Wales and probably had some considerable status there. Muircheartaigh O'Brien, no doubt hoping to emulate the achievements of his great-grandfather, involved himself in Scottish, Welsh and English politics. Muircheartaigh, most memorably, received a camel from Edgar, the Scottish king. There is also some evidence that he managed to assert himself to some degree in Galloway, in southwestern Scotland. Muircheartaigh and his father Turlough also received and sheltered a number of Welsh nobles and offered them military support. Turlough O'Brien supplied a Waterford contingent at the Battle of Minid Carn in Wales in 1081, and when Rhys ap Tudor was expelled from the Welsh kingdom of Deheubarth in 1088, he fled to Ireland and assembled a fleet there. When he was killed in 1093, his son spent the next 22 years of his life in Ireland, only returning to Wales in 1115. Later, in the aftermath of the Norman invasion of Anglesey, Owen ap Cadogan fled to Ireland, where he was received by Muircheartaigh O'Brien. Indeed, Owen, like Rhys ap Tudor, used military support received in Ireland to launch attacks in Wales. Ireland, in the years prior to the invasion, was no inward-looking backwater, charting its own idiosyncratic course through history in Europe's dreary northwestern periphery. It was responsive to continental developments, and its greater kings sought to harness these movements to boost their standing in a real-life Game of Thrones. Many of these themes, that of church reform and the like, will be explored later on today in our inquiry, and accordingly, I might leave it there. Thank you.